The desert heat shimmered across the military base in Afghanistan, where dust devils danced between the concrete barriers and armored vehicles. Sergeant Jake Martinez wiped sweat from his forehead as he adjusted his gear, checking his rifle for the third time that morning. The 22-year-old Marine from Texas had been deployed for 6 months, and the routine of base operations had become second nature to him. Jake was known among his unit for his easy smile and quick jokes, a way of keeping spirits up during the long, tense days in hostile territory. His fellow Marines appreciated his humor, especially during the quieter moments when the weight of their situation pressed down on everyone's shoulders. That morning, Jake noticed a new face among the group of soldiers gathering near the helicopter landing pad. She was smaller than most of the other service members, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and sharp, alert eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Her uniform bore no obvious insignia that Jake could immediately recognize, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that caught his attention. "Must be one of those special ops types," Jake muttered to his buddy, Corporal Davis, who was standing nearby cleaning his weapon. Davis looked up and followed Jake's gaze. "Yeah, probably. Been seeing more of them lately. Word is they're ramping up operations in the northern sectors." Jake had always been curious about the special operations teams that occasionally passed through their base. These elite soldiers seemed to exist in a different world, coming and going like shadows, their missions shrouded in secrecy. Most regular Marines like Jake rarely interacted with them beyond a brief nod or salute. The woman moved with purpose toward a group of officers who were studying maps spread across a makeshift table. Her posture was straight, professional, and there was something about the way she carried herself that suggested she was not someone to be underestimated. The other soldiers in the area seemed to give her space, though whether out of respect or uncertainty, Jake couldn't tell. "I wonder what her call sign is," Jake said, more to himself than to Davis. In military culture, call signs were badges of honor, usually earned through some memorable incident or characteristic that defined a soldier's reputation. Jake's own call sign was Tex, an obvious reference to his home state, though he secretly hoped to earn something more impressive during his deployment. Davis shrugged. "Probably something boring like Eagle or Phoenix. You know how these special ops people like their dramatic bird names." The conversation might have ended there, but Jake's natural curiosity and his tendency to strike up conversations with anyone got the better of him. As the woman finished her discussion with the officers and began walking in their direction, Jake decided to introduce himself. He approached her with his characteristic grin, adjusting his helmet slightly. "Morning, ma'am. Sergeant Martinez, 3rd Battalion. Don't think we've met." The woman turned to face him, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. Up close, Jake could see that she was probably in her late 20s, with small scars on her hands that spoke of extensive training and field experience. Her eyes were a striking green, and they seemed to assess him quickly and completely. "Good morning, Sergeant," she replied, her voice calm and professional. She didn't offer her name, which Jake found slightly unusual but not entirely unexpected, given the secretive nature of special operations. "Just curious," Jake continued, his smile widening. "What's your call sign? We always like to know who we're sharing the base with." The question seemed innocent enough to Jake. He was genuinely interested in meeting new people and understanding the diverse mix of military personnel that rotated through their base. Call signs were usually a safe topic of conversation, often leading to interesting stories about how they were earned. The woman paused for a moment, studying Jake's face as if trying to decide something. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, and Jake began to wonder if he had somehow overstepped a boundary. "Black Mamba," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His smile faded immediately, and he felt his stomach drop. In military circles, certain call signs carried weight that went far beyond simple nicknames. Black Mamba was not just any call sign. It was a legend whispered about in briefing rooms and mess halls across multiple theaters of operation. Jake had heard stories about Black Mamba during his training and throughout his deployment. The tales varied in detail, but they all centered around a sniper whose precision and lethality had become the stuff of military folklore. Some said Black Mamba had over 200 confirmed kills. Others claimed the number was even higher. What everyone agreed on was that crossing paths with Black Mamba in the field meant you were either very lucky to be on the same side, or you were already dead. The woman Jake had just casually approached, the person he had been making small talk with about call signs, was one of the most feared and respected snipers in the entire military. She wasn't just special operations, she was elite within the elite, a soldier whose reputation preceded her into every combat zone. Jake felt his mouth go dry as the implications sank in. This wasn't some desk officer or support personnel. This was a warrior who had earned her reputation through deadly precision in the most dangerous situations imaginable. The casual conversation he had initiated suddenly felt incredibly naive. Jake stammered, for once in his life completely at a loss for words. Black Mamba's expression remained unchanged, but Jake thought he detected the slightest hint of amusement in her eyes. She was clearly accustomed to this reaction when people learned her identity. "Something wrong, Sergeant?" she asked, her tone still professional but with an edge that suggested she was fully aware of the effect her revelation had just had. Jake stood frozen, suddenly very aware of how young and inexperienced he must seem to someone with her background. The easy confidence he had felt moments before evaporated completely, replaced by a mixture of awe, respect, and genuine fear. He was standing face to face with a living legend, someone whose skills and experiences were far beyond anything he could imagine. Jake's mind raced as he tried to process what he had just learned. The stories about Black Mamba weren't just rumors or exaggerated tales told around campfires. They were real, and the person responsible for those legendary achievements was standing right in front of him. He felt like he had just discovered that a character from a war movie had stepped into real life. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably as Jake struggled to find his voice. Black Mamba waited patiently, her green eyes studying him with what might have been mild curiosity. It was clear that she was used to this kind of reaction, though she seemed neither pleased nor annoyed by it. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Jake finally managed to say, his voice noticeably shakier than it had been moments before. "I didn't know. I mean, I've heard the stories, but I never thought that I'd be real," Black Mamba finished for him, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Or that I'd be a woman." The question caught Jake off guard. He hadn't really considered the gender aspect until she mentioned it, but now that she had, he realized that all the stories he had heard about Black Mamba had never specified whether the legendary sniper was male or female. In his mind, he had simply assumed it was a man, partly because most snipers he had encountered were men, and partly because the reputation seemed almost superhuman. Both, I guess, Jake admitted honestly. "The stories make you sound like some kind of ghost or machine. I never really thought about you being, well, a real person." Black Mamba's expression softened slightly at his honesty. "The stories tend to get exaggerated over time," she said. "I'm just a soldier doing my job." But Jake knew that wasn't entirely true. Even allowing for exaggeration, the core facts about Black Mamba's service record were well documented. She had served in multiple combat zones, completed missions that others had deemed impossible, and saved countless lives through her extraordinary skills. This wasn't just any soldier. This was someone who operated at a level that most people could never reach. Corporal Davis had been watching the exchange from a distance, and now he approached cautiously. Jake could see the confusion on his friend's face as he tried to understand why Jake had suddenly become so serious and respectful toward this unknown soldier. "Everything okay here?" Davis asked, looking between Jake and Black Mamba uncertainly. Jake turned to his friend, still feeling somewhat dazed. "Davis, I'd like you to meet Black Mamba." The effect on Davis was immediate and dramatic. His eyes widened in shock, and he nearly dropped the weapon he had been carrying. Like Jake, Davis had heard the stories, and like Jake, he had never expected to actually meet the person behind the legend. "No way," Davis whispered, staring at Black Mamba as if she might disappear if he blinked. "You're really... are you actually..." "Yes," Black Mamba confirmed simply, "though I prefer Sarah when we're not in the field." The use of her real name somehow made the situation even more surreal for Jake. Here was a person who had become almost mythical in military circles, and she was offering to be called by her first name. It was like discovering that Superman's real identity was Clark Kent, except in reverse. "Sarah," Jake repeated, testing the name. It seemed too ordinary, too normal for someone with such an extraordinary reputation. But as he looked at her again, he began to see the person behind the legend. She was still clearly a formidable soldier. That much was evident in her posture, her awareness of her surroundings. and the way she carried herself, but she was also just a human being. How long have you been deployed here? Sarah asked, apparently willing to continue the conversation despite the awkward beginning. 6 months, Jake replied, grateful for the chance to focus on something normal. This is my first deployment. Still learning the ropes, obviously. First deployment can be challenging, Sarah acknowledged. How are you finding it? Jake appreciated that she was treating him like a regular soldier, rather than some starstruck kid, even though that was essentially what he felt like. It's been an education, he said. Different from what I expected, but good experience. What did you expect? Sarah asked, and Jake detected genuine interest in her voice. I guess I thought it would be more like the movies, Jake admitted. More action, more clear-cut situations. Reality is a lot more complicated. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. It usually is. The movies don't show you the waiting, the uncertainty, the times when the right choice isn't obvious. As they talked, Jake began to relax slightly. Sarah was certainly intimidating given her reputation, but she was also surprisingly approachable. She didn't seem to be putting on airs or trying to live up to her fearsome image. If anything, she seemed more interested in having a normal conversation than in maintaining any kind of mystique. Davis, meanwhile, remained largely silent, still apparently processing the fact that he was talking to someone whose exploits he had heard about in training exercises and briefings. Jake could understand his friend's reaction. It was like meeting a celebrity, except this celebrity's fame came from deadly efficiency in combat situations. So what brings you to our little corner of paradise? Jake asked, gesturing around at the dusty utilitarian base. Can't really discuss the details, Sarah replied, which Jake had expected, but I'll be here for a while. Probably see you around. The prospect of regularly encountering Black Mamba around the base was both exciting and terrifying to Jake. On one hand, he was fascinated by the opportunity to interact with someone of her caliber. On the other hand, her very presence suggested that something significant was happening, something that required the services of one of the military's most elite operators. Well, if there's anything we can do to help, Jake offered, though he immediately realized how inadequate his assistance would likely be to someone of her capabilities. I appreciate that, Sarah said, and Jake got the impression that she meant it. It's always good to know the local personnel. A radio crackled to life on Sarah's belt, and she listened to a brief message that Jake couldn't quite make out. Her expression became more serious and she straightened slightly. I have to go, she said. Nice meeting you both. Likewise, Jake replied, still feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the encounter. Sarah nodded to both of them and began walking toward a group of vehicles near the command center. Jake and Davis watched her go, both of them still processing what had just happened. After Sarah disappeared around the corner of a supply building, Jake and Davis stood in stunned silence for several moments. The normal sounds of base operations continued around them, engines starting, soldiers calling to each other, the distant hum of generators. But for Jake, everything seemed different now. The routine day had been transformed by a single encounter that would likely stay with him for the rest of his life. Did that really just happen? Davis finally asked, breaking the silence. Jake nodded slowly, still staring in the direction Sarah had gone. I think I just made the biggest mistake of my military career. What do you mean? Davis asked, confused. I walked up to Black Mamba like she was just another soldier and asked for her call sign as a joke, Jake explained, the full weight of his actions starting to sink in. Do you have any idea how stupid that was? Davis thought about it for a moment. Actually, when you put it that way, yeah, that was pretty stupid. But she seemed okay with it. She was being polite, Jake said. People like that don't stay alive by making enemies out of random Marines who approach them on base. As the day progressed, Jake found it difficult to concentrate on his regular duties. His mind kept returning to the conversation with Sarah, analyzing every word and gesture for clues about what she had really thought of his approach. He replayed the moment when she revealed her call sign, remembering the way his stomach had dropped and his confidence had evaporated. During lunch in the mess hall, word about the encounter began to spread among Jake's unit. Davis had apparently told a few people about meeting Black Mamba, and by the time Jake sat down with his tray, several Marines were asking him about the experience. Is it true you just walked up to her and started talking? Asked Private Rodriguez, a young Marine who had arrived on base just a few weeks earlier. It wasn't like that, Jake protested, though he wasn't entirely sure how to explain what it had been like. I didn't know who she was. But when you found out what happened, Rodriguez pressed. Did she say anything about her missions? She can't talk about her missions, Jake replied, feeling slightly frustrated by the questions. That's not how this works, but Jake understood Rodriguez's curiosity. Meeting someone with Black Mamba's reputation was the kind of experience that most soldiers could only dream about. It was like getting a glimpse behind the curtain of military operations that most people never saw. Sergeant Williams, who had been deployed twice before and had more experience than most of the younger Marines, joined the conversation. You guys need to understand something, he said seriously. People like Black Mamba don't end up at bases like this unless something big is happening. Her being here means the situation in this region is more serious than they're telling us. Williams's words sent a chill through the group. Jake hadn't considered that Sarah's presence might be an indicator of increased danger or upcoming operations. He had been so focused on the celebrity aspect of meeting her that he hadn't thought about the tactical implications. What kind of operations? Rodriguez asked nervously. The kind that require the best sniper in the military, Williams replied grimly, which means someone out there needs to be taken out and it's not going to be easy. That afternoon, Jake found himself paying more attention to the activity around the base. He noticed that there seemed to be more meetings among the officers, more vehicles coming and going, and a general sense of increased preparation. Whether this was related to Sarah's presence or just his heightened awareness, he couldn't be sure, but something was definitely happening. Around 4 o'clock, Jake was helping unload supplies from a transport truck when he saw Sarah again. She was walking across the compound with 2 other soldiers he didn't recognize, all of them carrying what appeared to be specialized equipment. Even from a distance, Jake could see that she moved differently when she was in operational mode. More focused, more purposeful, like a predator preparing for a hunt. There she is again, Davis said quietly, following Jake's gaze. Yeah, Jake replied, watching as the group disappeared into a building that housed some of the base's communication equipment. Williams was right. Something's definitely going on. That evening, Jake lay on his cot in the barracks, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about the day's events. The more he reflected on his encounter with Sarah, the more he realized how much it had affected him. It wasn't just the shock of meeting someone famous. It was the realization that there were levels of military service that he had never really understood. Jake had always thought he had a pretty good grasp of what military life was like. He had completed his training, deployed to a combat zone, and performed his duties competently. But meeting Sarah had shown him that there was an entire tier of military operations that existed beyond his experience and understanding. The stories about Black Mamba weren't just about marksmanship, though that was certainly part of it. They were about someone who operated in situations where failure meant death, not just for herself, but potentially for many others. The pressure of that kind of responsibility was something Jake could barely imagine. He thought about the calm way Sarah had revealed her identity, almost casually, as if she were saying her name was Smith or Johnson. There had been no boasting, no attempt to impress him with her accomplishments. If anything, she had seemed slightly amused by his reaction, as if she encountered that kind of response regularly. Hey, Jake, Davis said from the neighboring cot. You still thinking about this morning? Yeah, Jake admitted. Can't seem to get it out of my head. I know what you mean, Davis replied. It's like finding out that one of those stories your grandfather tells about the war is actually true, and the hero is still alive. That was exactly what it was like, Jake realized. The military was full of legends and stories, most of which grew in the telling until they bore little resemblance to reality. But occasionally, very occasionally, you encountered something that was exactly as impressive as the stories suggested. Do you think she'll remember us? Davis asked. Jake considered the question. Probably. People like that notice everything. Think we'll see her again? I hope so, Jake said honestly. And I hope next time I don't make such an idiot of myself. As Jake finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was about the contrast between Sarah's fearsome reputation and her relatively normal demeanor. She was clearly someone who had seen and done things that would give most people nightmares, but she had also been willing to have a casual conversation with a nervous young Marine who had approached her out of simple curiosity. The encounter had left Jake with more questions than answers. but it had also given him a new perspective on what it meant to serve in the military. There were people like him, doing their jobs and learning as they went, and then there were people like Sarah, operating at a level that most soldiers would never reach. Tomorrow, Jake decided he would try to be a better Marine, inspired by his brief encounter with someone who represented the very best of what military service could be. 3 days after his first encounter with Sarah, Jake was beginning to think he might not see her again. The base was large enough that it was entirely possible for someone to be stationed there, without their paths crossing regularly, especially if that someone was involved in classified operations that kept them away from general population areas. But on Thursday morning, while Jake was conducting routine maintenance on one of the base's defensive positions, he spotted a familiar figure near the communications building. Sarah was standing with a group of officers, pointing at what appeared to be satellite imagery spread across a portable table. Even from his position 50 yards away, Jake could see the intensity of the discussion taking place. "Martinez," Sergeant Williams called out, breaking Jake's concentration. "Those sandbags aren't going to move themselves." Jake returned to his work, but he found himself glancing repeatedly toward the group around the table. There was something about the body language of the officers that suggested urgency. Whatever operation Sarah was involved in, it appeared to be moving into an active phase. About an hour later, as Jake was finishing up the maintenance work, he was surprised to see Sarah walking in his direction. She was alone this time, and she seemed to be taking a deliberate path toward his position. "Sergeant Martinez," she said as she approached, using his formal rank despite having told him to call her Sarah during their first meeting. "Ma'am," Jake replied, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag. He was determined to be more professional this time, having learned from his previous mistake. "I wanted to thank you for the other day," Sarah said, which was the last thing Jake had expected to hear. "Thank me?" Jake asked, confused. "For what?" "For treating me like a regular soldier," Sarah explained. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Jake thought about her words for a moment. He supposed that someone with Sarah's reputation probably had to deal with a lot of people who either treated her like a celebrity or were too intimidated to interact with her. "Normally I was just being friendly," Jake said, "though I probably should have been more respectful once I knew who you were." "Respect is fine," Sarah replied, "but I appreciate people who aren't afraid to have a normal conversation." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the activity around the base. Jake noticed that Sarah's eyes were constantly moving, taking in everything around them. It was a habit that probably came from years of operating in hostile environments where situational awareness was the difference between life and death. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said, then immediately regretted the question. He didn't want to risk overstepping boundaries again. "Go ahead," Sarah said. "How do you deal with the reputation? I mean, having everyone know who you are before you even introduce yourself." Sarah considered the question carefully. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Sometimes the reputation is useful. It can make people take you seriously right away. But other times it gets in the way of doing the job." "How does it get in the way?" "People expect you to be perfect," Sarah explained. "They expect you to have all the answers, to never make mistakes. But everyone makes mistakes. The key is making sure your mistakes don't get people killed." Jake found this perspective fascinating. He had never considered the pressure that must come with having such a legendary reputation. Everyone expected Black Mamba to be superhuman, but Sarah was clearly very aware of her own limitations and humanity. "Do you ever regret it? Getting involved in this kind of work, I mean." "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "It's not an easy life. You miss a lot of things that other people take for granted, but when you can make a difference, when you can save lives or complete a mission that others can't, it feels worth it." As they continued talking, Jake began to understand that Sarah was sharing something with him that she probably didn't discuss with many people. The isolation that came with her level of military service was something most people couldn't understand or relate to. "What about you?" Sarah asked, turning the conversation back to Jake. "What made you decide to join the Marines?" "Family tradition, mostly," Jake replied. "My dad served, my grandfather served. It seemed like the natural thing to do." "And now that you're here?" Jake thought about the question. "It's harder than I expected, but I'm glad I did it. I'm learning things about myself that I never would have learned otherwise." "That's the point," Sarah said. "The military shows you who you really are when everything comfortable is stripped away." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of another soldier, a staff sergeant that Jake didn't recognize. The man spoke briefly with Sarah in tones too low for Jake to overhear, but he could see that the message was urgent. "I have to go," Sarah said, turning back to Jake. "But I wanted to ask you something. How well do you know the local area around the base?" "Pretty well," Jake replied. "We've been on patrol several times and I've studied the maps pretty thoroughly." "Why?" "We might need someone who knows the terrain for an upcoming operation, someone who can guide a small team without drawing attention." Jake felt his heart rate increase. Was Sarah suggesting that he might be involved in whatever mission she was planning? The possibility was both exciting and terrifying. "I'd be honored to help in any way I can," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It would be dangerous," Sarah warned. "More dangerous than regular patrol duty." "I understand." Sarah studied his face for a moment, as if trying to assess his readiness for what she might be asking of him. "I'll talk to your commanding officer about temporarily assigning you to our team." "But Jake," she said, using his first name for the first time, "if you're not absolutely sure about this, say so now. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Jake thought about her words carefully. This was clearly an opportunity that could define his military career, but it was also potentially life-threatening. Sarah wasn't offering him a chance for glory. She was asking if he was willing to risk his life for a mission he knew nothing about. "I'm sure," Jake said finally. "Whatever you need, I'm ready." Sarah nodded, apparently satisfied with his response. "Good. If this goes through, you'll be briefed tomorrow morning. Until then, don't discuss this with anyone, not even Davis." "Understood." "And Jake," Sarah added as she turned to leave, "make sure you get a good night's sleep tonight. Tomorrow is going to be very different from anything you've experienced so far." As Jake watched Sarah walk away, he felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety that made it difficult to focus on anything else. In the span of a few minutes, his deployment had gone from routine base operations to potential involvement in a classified mission with one of the military's most elite operators. He tried to continue his maintenance work, but his hands were shaking slightly as he handled the tools. The weight of what Sarah had proposed was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about meeting a famous soldier anymore. This was about potentially proving himself worthy of operating at a level he had never imagined reaching. That evening, Jake lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the day's events. He had told Sarah he was ready, but was he really? Tomorrow would begin to provide the answer to that question. Jake woke up before his alarm, having slept restlessly through the night. Every time he had started to drift off, his mind would race with thoughts about what the day might bring. When he finally got up, he felt more nervous than he had since his first day of basic training. At 600 hours, a soldier Jake didn't recognize appeared at the barracks and quietly asked him to come along. Davis was still asleep, which Jake was grateful for. He didn't want to try to explain where he was going when he didn't really know himself. The soldier led him to a building Jake had never been inside before, one that required special clearance to enter. As they walked through hallways lined with secure communications equipment, Jake realized he was entering a part of the base that most regular personnel never saw. They arrived at a briefing room where Sarah was waiting along with 3 other soldiers. Jake recognized one of them as the staff sergeant who had spoken with Sarah the day before. The others were new to him, but their bearing and equipment clearly marked them as special operations personnel. "Take a seat, Martinez," Sarah said, gesturing to a chair at the briefing table. Her tone was more formal now, all business. For the next hour, Jake received the most comprehensive mission briefing of his military career. The target was a high-value, enemy commander who had been coordinating attacks against coalition forces from a compound approximately 15 miles from their base. Intelligence indicated that the commander would be at a specific location for a limited window of time, creating an opportunity for elimination. The mission required a small team to move through challenging terrain to reach an overwatch position where Sarah could take the shot. The route would take them through areas that Jake had patrolled, which was why his knowledge of the local terrain was valuable. "Your job is to guide us to the position and help us avoid any complications along the way," explained Captain Morrison, the team leader. "You'll be our eyes and ears for anything that seems out of place or dangerous." Jake listened carefully as they went over maps, timing, communication protocols, and contingency plans. The level of detail and preparation was unlike anything he had experienced in regular Marine operations. Every aspect of the mission had been planned and planned again, with backup plans for the backup plans. "This is a high-risk operation," Captain Morrison continued. "The target area is heavily defended, and if we're discovered, extraction will be extremely difficult. Is there anything about this mission that makes you uncomfortable?" Jake thought about the question honestly. Everything about the mission made him uncomfortable, from the danger involved to his own inexperience with this type of operation. But he also knew that this was exactly the kind of challenge he had joined the military to face. "I understand the risks," Jake said. "I'm ready to do my part." Sarah had been quiet during most of the briefing, but now she spoke up. "Martinez, I need you to understand something. Out there, you're not just representing yourself or your unit. You're representing everyone who has ever trusted you. If you make a mistake, people die. Can you handle that pressure?" The weight of her words settled on Jake like a physical burden. He had never been in a situation where his actions could directly result in the death of his teammates. The responsibility was almost overwhelming. "I can handle it," Jake said, though his voice came out quieter than he had intended. "Good," Sarah replied, "because once we're out there, there's no room for doubt or second-guessing. You need to trust your training and your instincts." The rest of the morning was spent going over equipment and conducting rehearsals. Jake was issued specialized gear he had never used before, including advanced night vision equipment and a communication system that allowed the team to stay in constant contact without speaking aloud. As they prepared to depart, Jake found himself thinking about Davis and the other Marines in his unit who were going about their normal duties, unaware that their fellow soldier was about to embark on what could be the most dangerous mission of his life. Part of him envied their routine concerns and simple objectives. "You look nervous," Sarah observed as they conducted final equipment checks. "I am nervous," Jake admitted, "but I'm also excited. This is what I joined the military for, even if I didn't know it at the time." "Nervous is good," Sarah said. "It means you're taking this seriously. But don't let it paralyze you. Trust your training and remember that we're all counting on each other." At 1400 hours, the team moved out. They left the base in a vehicle that took them to a departure point several miles away, where they would begin their approach on foot. The landscape was rugged and challenging, with rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation that provided both concealment and obstacles. Jake took point, using his knowledge of the terrain to guide the team along routes that would minimize their exposure, while still allowing them to make good time. The responsibility of leading such an elite team through hostile territory was intense, but Jake found that his nervousness was beginning to transform into focused concentration. As they moved through the late afternoon heat, Jake became aware of how different this operation felt from regular patrol duty. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. The team moved with a synchronization and precision that spoke of countless hours of training and experience. Sarah, despite carrying a heavy sniper rifle and additional equipment, moved through the terrain with an ease that Jake found impressive. She seemed to flow over obstacles that required effort from the rest of the team, and her awareness of their surroundings was constant and comprehensive. "How much further to the first checkpoint?" Captain Morrison asked quietly during a brief halt. Jake checked his position against the map and his memory of previous patrols. "About 2 clicks," he replied. "But we'll need to be careful crossing the next valley. There's usually some local traffic through that area." "What kind of traffic?" Sarah asked. "Mostly farmers and herders," Jake explained. "They're probably not hostile, but they might report our presence to the wrong people." The team adjusted their route to minimize the risk of detection, adding time to their movement, but significantly reducing the chance of compromise. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, Jake felt increasingly confident in his ability to navigate the challenging terrain while keeping the team safe. By the time they reached their planned overnight position, Jake had guided them through several potentially dangerous areas without incident. As they established a secure perimeter for the night, Captain Morrison approached him. "Good work today, Martinez," the captain said quietly. "Your knowledge of the area has been invaluable." "Thank you, sir," Jake replied, feeling a sense of accomplishment that was different from anything he had experienced before. As the team settled in for a few hours of rest before the final approach to their target, Jake reflected on how much had changed since his casual encounter with Sarah just a few days earlier. He was no longer just a regular Marine going through the motions of deployment. He was now part of a mission that could have significant impact on the safety of coalition forces throughout the region. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and terrifying. Jake woke from a light sleep at 300 hours, his internal clock and training combining to bring him to full alertness immediately. Around him, the other team members were already stirring, preparing for the final phase of their mission. The night air was cold, a sharp contrast to the desert heat they had endured during the day. Sarah was checking her rifle with methodical precision, running through a process that Jake realized she had probably performed hundreds of times before. Every movement was economical and purposeful, reflecting years of experience in situations where equipment failure could mean mission failure and death. Final approach starts in 30 minutes, Captain Morrison announced quietly. Martinez, you'll guide us to the observation point, then maintain security while Black Mamba takes the shot. Jake nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of nervousness and determination that had become his constant companion since joining this operation. The next few hours would determine whether all their preparation and risk had been worthwhile. The team moved out into the pre-dawn darkness, using their night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain. Jake led them along a route he had carefully planned, one that would bring them to within 800 meters of the target compound while providing the concealment and elevation Sarah needed for an effective, shot. As they climbed through rocky outcroppings toward their destination, Jake found himself thinking about the enemy commander they were hunting. Intelligence reports had painted a picture of a man responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces, someone whose removal would save American and Allied lives. The mission wasn't just about demonstrating Jake's abilities or proving his worth. It was about stopping someone who was actively working to kill people like Davis and the other Marines back at base. Target building is just over this ridge, Jake whispered into his microphone as they approached the final approach to their observation position. Copy, Sarah replied. How's the visibility from up there? Jake carefully moved to a position where he could observe the target area without exposing himself. The compound was exactly where intelligence had indicated, a collection of buildings surrounded by walls and defensive positions. Even in the darkness, he could see that it was well defended and would be extremely difficult to assault directly. Perfect line of sight, Jake reported. No obstructions, distance looks good. The team moved into their final position with practiced efficiency. Sarah found a spot among the rocks that provided both concealment and a stable shooting platform, while the other team members established a defensive perimeter. Jake positioned himself where he could observe the approaches to their position and watch for any signs that their presence had been detected. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, Jake watched Sarah prepare for what might be the most important shot of her career. She moved through her routine with calm focus, adjusting her scope, checking wind conditions, and calculating the various factors that would affect her bullet's trajectory over the 800-meter distance to the target. Target should appear at the north window of the main building sometime in the next hour. Captain Morrison relayed through their communication system. Intel says he has a morning briefing with his subordinates every day at approximately 0630. Jake found himself holding his breath as they waited. The tension was unlike anything he had experienced even during combat patrols. This wasn't about surviving contact with the enemy. This was about executing a precise operation that required everything to go exactly right. At 0625, movement appeared in the target building. Through his binoculars, Jake could see figures moving around inside, visible through windows that intelligence had identified as the commander's usual location. I have movement in the target area, Sarah reported calmly. Multiple individuals, but I don't have positive identification yet. Jake watched as Sarah made minute adjustments to her position and scope settings. Her breathing had become slow and controlled, and she seemed to enter a state of complete focus that shut out everything except the target and the shot she needed to make. Target confirmed, Sarah said suddenly. Male individual matching description, north window, engaged in briefing activity. You are cleared to engage, Captain Morrison replied. Jake watched Sarah's final preparations with fascination and respect. Despite all the stories he had heard about Black Mamba's legendary marksmanship, seeing her actually prepare to take a shot was something entirely different. There was no drama, no tension in her movements, just professional competence applied to an extraordinarily difficult task. The shot, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. A sharp crack echoed across the valley, followed by immediate activity in the target compound as the occupants realized they were under attack. "Target down," Sarah reported matter-of-factly. "Direct hit, no movement." But their mission wasn't over. The compound was now fully alert, and Jake could see armed figures beginning to spread out from the buildings, searching for the source of the shot. Some of them were moving in the general direction of the team's position. "Time to go," Captain Morrison announced. "Martinez, get us out of here." Jake led the team down from their observation position using a route he had planned specifically for rapid extraction. The descent was challenging, especially while maintaining the noise discipline necessary to avoid detection. But Jake's knowledge of the terrain allowed them to move quickly, without exposing themselves to enemy observation. As they moved through the early morning landscape, Jake could hear the sounds of pursuit behind them. Vehicles were starting up in the compound, and he knew that enemy forces would soon be searching the area systematically. The team needed to reach their extraction point before the search expanded to include their planned route. "How much further?" Sarah asked as they paused briefly behind a rocky outcropping. "2 clicks to the extraction point," Jake replied. "But we need to cross some open ground and they'll probably have patrols out soon. Can we go around?" Captain Morrison asked. Jake considered their options. The direct route was dangerous but fast. Alternative routes would take longer but provide more concealment. Given the level of enemy activity they could hear behind them, speed seemed more important than perfect concealment. "Direct road is our best option," Jake decided. "We can be there in 40 minutes if we push hard." "Do it," Morrison ordered. The next 40 minutes were the most intense of Jake's life. The team moved as fast as they could while still maintaining security, crossing open areas in short rushes and using every piece of available cover. Jake's knowledge of the terrain proved crucial as he guided them around obstacles and through routes that wouldn't be obvious to pursuing enemy forces. When they finally reached the extraction point, Jake felt a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming. A helicopter was waiting for them, its crew ready to depart immediately. As the team climbed aboard, Jake took one last look at the landscape they had just crossed, hardly believing that he had successfully guided an elite special operations team through such a dangerous mission. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Captain Morrison said over the helicopter's intercom as they lifted off. "Your performance today was exceptional." Jake felt a pride that was different from any satisfaction he had experienced before. He had been tested in the most challenging circumstances possible, and had proven himself worthy of the trust that Sarah and the team had placed in him. The helicopter ride back to base gave Jake time to process what had just happened. As the landscape scrolled beneath them, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in less than a week. 7 days ago, he had been a regular Marine going through the routine of deployment. Now he was returning from a classified special operations mission that would likely remain secret for years to come. Sarah sat across from him in the helicopter, her sniper rifle secured between her knees. She looked as calm as if she had just returned from a routine training exercise, despite having just eliminated a high-value target under extremely challenging conditions. Jake found her composure both impressive and slightly intimidating. When they landed at the base, Jake was surprised to see several senior officers waiting for them. Word of the mission's success had apparently already reached the command structure, and there would be immediate debriefings and after-action reports to complete. "Martinez," Captain Morrison said as they walked toward the command building, "your performance today will be reflected in my report. You conducted yourself with distinction under extremely difficult circumstances." "Thank you, sir," Jake replied, still feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the praise from such experienced soldiers. The debriefing process took several hours. Jake found himself answering detailed questions about terrain conditions, enemy activity, and the effectiveness of their planned routes. His observations were treated as valuable intelligence that would inform future operations in the region. During a break in the debriefing process, Sarah approached Jake privately. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said. "Your knowledge of the area and your performance under pressure were crucial to the mission's success." "I was just doing my job," Jake replied, though he felt proud of her recognition. No, Sarah said firmly. You did much more than your job. You stepped up to a level of responsibility that most soldiers never face, and you handled it perfectly. She paused for a moment, then continued. I've been in this business for a long time, and I've worked with a lot of different people. You have the instincts and the courage for this kind of work. If you're ever interested in pursuing special operations training, I'd be happy to provide a recommendation. Jake was stunned. The idea of potentially joining the ranks of special operations had never seriously occurred to him. But hearing the suggestion from someone of Sarah's caliber was incredibly flattering and inspiring. I would be honored by your recommendation, Jake said. This mission showed me that there are aspects of military service I never knew existed. Think about it seriously, Sarah advised. It's not an easy path, and it requires sacrifices that not everyone is willing to make. But for the right person, it's the most meaningful work you can do. That evening, Jake returned to his regular barracks, where Davis and the other Marines were eager to know where he had been for the past 2 days. Jake was required to give them only the most general explanation, that he had been temporarily assigned to assist with a classified operation. Come on, man, Davis pressed. At least tell us if it was dangerous. It was challenging, Jake admitted. But I can't discuss the details. Jake understood his friend's curiosity, but he also understood the importance of operational security. The mission he had just completed could potentially save lives by disrupting enemy operations, but only if the details remained secret. Over the following days, Jake found it difficult to return to the routine of regular base operations. Everything seemed different now, though he couldn't explain exactly how or why. His perspective on military service had been fundamentally altered by his experience working with Sarah's team. The other Marines in his unit began to notice changes in Jake's demeanor and performance. He was more focused during training exercises, more serious about equipment maintenance, and more interested in studying tactical manuals during his free time. You're different since you got back from wherever you went, Davis observed one evening as they cleaned their weapons together. How so? Jake asked. More serious, I guess. Like you're thinking about things the rest of us aren't thinking about. Davis was more perceptive than Jake had realized. The mission with Sarah had indeed given him new things to think about, new goals to consider, and a new understanding of what was possible in military service. A week after the mission, Jake received word that his performance had earned him a commendation, and that his commanding officer wanted to discuss his future career plans. During that meeting, Jake learned that his participation in the Special Operations mission had opened doors he had never expected. You've been noticed by some very important people, his commanding officer explained. There are opportunities available to you now that weren't there before. What kind of opportunities? Jake asked. Advanced training, special assignments, career paths that could take you in directions most Marines never have the chance to explore. That night, Jake lay in his cot thinking about the choices before him. He could continue his current path, complete his deployment, and return to civilian life with valuable experience and good memories. Or he could pursue the more challenging and dangerous path that Sarah had suggested, one that would demand more of him than he had ever given before. As he weighed his options, Jake found his thoughts returning to the moments during the mission when everything had depended on his decisions and his performance. The pressure had been intense, but so had the satisfaction of meeting that challenge successfully. 3 months later, Jake submitted his application for Special Operations training. In his recommendation letter, Sarah wrote that Sergeant Martinez had demonstrated the courage, intelligence, and dedication necessary for the most demanding military assignments. Years later, when Jake had become an experienced Special Operations soldier himself, he would often think back to that morning when he had casually approached a woman at the base and asked about her call sign. What had started as a simple joke had become the defining moment of his military career. He never forgot the lesson that Sarah had taught him through her example. That true military excellence wasn't about seeking glory or recognition, but about being ready to step up when others needed you, regardless of the personal cost or danger involved. The encounter with Black Mamba had changed Jake's life in ways he could never have anticipated, proving that sometimes the most important moments begin with the simplest interactions. A casual question asked out of curiosity had led to opportunities and challenges that would shape the rest of his military career. And whenever young soldiers asked Jake about his own experiences, he would always emphasize the same lesson Sarah had shown him, that the most important thing a soldier could do was be ready when the moment came to prove their worth. Because in the military, that moment could arrive at any time and in any form.